Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Why aren't more women holding Division I college presidencies? While many smaller colleges, especially at the community college level, have seen significant growth in women leading institutions, the numbers dwindle as you move towards Division I. Is there a perception that women presidents can't manage big-time college sports? Today's podcast includes an important discussion about presidents, college sports, and the 2023 ACE study on presidents in higher education, released in spring of 2023. My guest is Dr. Pamela Eddy, a professor of higher education at the College of William and Mary. Pamela's research interests include community college leadership and development, organizational change and educational partnerships, gender roles in higher education, and faculty development. Dr. Eddy serves as a consultant for campuses, system offices, and on funded grants regarding strategies to support community college student success and to support leadership development. Dr. Eddy just recently wrote an insightful article for Inside Higher Ed on women and leadership, which is linked in the broadcast notes. Pamela, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you could join me today.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
So you spent a lot of time looking at the 2023 ACE Presidential Leadership Survey, which comes out every 5 years. And it's really a good, maybe it's a snapshot, maybe it's a deeper dive into where leadership trends are going. And in particular, I'd like us to focus today on where the trends are going for women in presidential leadership. And so I'm wondering if you wrote an outstanding article for Inside Higher Ed, which I will attach to the liner notes for this episode, just about overview of the report and also takeaways and recommendations do you have. So let's just start. Tell my listeners about the report so they know what this is.
Sure. The American Council on Education started doing their presidential survey about 1986. So I've actually been using some of the historical data to understand the trends better, and in particular for women presidents. So in that 1986 edition, you can imagine that the numbers were quite low, about 8%. And so now we are up into the high 30%, and depending on institutional type, or even higher than that. And so on the one hand, when I first started looking at the data, there was quite a bit of celebration. Look how far we've come. Look how far we've come as women in these top level leadership ranks. However, when you started peeling back the onion a bit, you could see that progress was uneven across institutional types. So we see, and this trend has held true with the most recent survey, that the majority of women presidents are located at community colleges and fewer at doctoral granting colleges. So as we think about prestige from an institutional perspective, on the one hand, with community colleges, we're up to 43%. So if you think of the idea of a tipping point, that's often referenced at about 40%. So one could argue that we've reached this tipping point with women in community colleges, and it should become not a big issue when you have a new president to say, oh, we have a woman president. We would just say, we have a new president. And so we would be able to not have to worry about that kind of notoriety anymore. We still see lower numbers at doctoral granting institutions and also at some of the more prestigious Ivy Leagues as well. We're looking at some breakthroughs within that, and even more so with some of the recent hires with women of color leading some of those institutions. So what's interested me as I've looked at it is to try to understand the pathways women have to the position. Does it look different than men? We have this age-old conversation always that women lead different than men lead different. And I would say, well, there's truth in both that and there's no difference. So we see an entire continuum. And so trying to pigeonhole into one category really is not always as useful. What I would point out with this recent survey that I think is quite a nice addition is the timeline of when women first start thinking of aspiring to a presidential position. This is the first time that question was included in the survey. And there had been an advisory committee as they were coming ready to launch the survey. So I think they really listened well at ACE and took in suggestions such as, when do you start thinking about it? And what we found with that data is that women start thinking and contemplating a presidency later than men. And this also would correspond with historical data of the age when women became presidents versus men when they became presidents. Often that's linked to other factors. If women have children, how portable are they? Do they have a portable husband or partner or significant other? Because that can make some difference as well. I've interviewed a number of women presidents that would indicate it. I had to wait till my partner retired before it was my turn. And so there's some bit of sequencing that we might see. So that delay of thinking of a presidency is something that we could work on as we would start thinking of how to develop more women along the pipeline.
There's a lot there to unpack. Certainly, my one question my listeners might ask is, do you see that same sort of deference on the men's side with their spouse not wanting to necessarily move until they retire?
I would say not as much. You will look and see there is a category of a question that indicates, did your spouse, have to move with giving up a job or not? And you see that occurring less frequently or noted less frequently is another. I would like to also point out that we do see an expansion in terms of how people take care of home responsibilities. That clearly has changed over time. However, what we found during the pandemic is that there was really a lot that reverted to historical gender roles with respect to that. More women leaving the workforce, women opting to wait to go up for a promotion because the timing, the demands of children at home in particular, or working with elderly parents who were particularly hit during the pandemic. And we're still looking at some recovery from that. I think philosophically, we're also addressing what is life about and what is work about and where do we find value. So we have a bit of that occurring concurrently with this.
Yeah, it's really an interesting phenomenon. One of the things that I struck me as you were describing where the most number of women presidents are is at the community college level. And that it sort of trends downward as the higher up you go in academic prestige. I can tell you at the University of Pennsylvania, we've had 3 of our past 4 presidents have been women, which has really been kind of amazing. And it almost seems like no big deal anymore. Yes, another woman, great. We're glad to have you. Can you raise money? I mean, that's kind of the mentality, but that doesn't seem to be true at big time athletic powerhouses necessarily, like the University of Alabama or the University of Texas necessarily. Talk a little bit about that space.
I think what there is there's still a normed idea of what the ideal leader looks like, acts like, is. And so we make certain assumptions about what kind of characteristics individuals need. And on this topic of when I think of the athletic powerhouse places in particular, and the regional context, you add that extra layer on there. There are very particular expectations of that. I think as we would begin seeing women increase in the precursor positions, where we start having that pipeline being more robust, we'll begin to see some tapping on that glass ceiling that has historically been there. Part of it also is going to depend on how we start seeing the performances when women are selected as the president. There is a concept known as the glass cliff. And what that indicates is that often women are hired when institutions are struggling or there's issues going on. And so when they take over that institution, if something happens that's negative, it has a way to be blamed on the person versus the context of the scenario. So the ability to move up in that sort of pecking order is one where you have more success at some of these intermediary steps. So I'm a provost at a Big Ten, and so I've had to deal with a lot of things there. Then I can make the jump up. And so trying to think of what is it that allows for that, like that jumping, like what gives us that height almost that you might think of. And one of the aspects of this is, how do we think of where are these presidents coming from? We do see an increase of presidents coming from more non-traditional pathways, but we still have the stubborn reliance on you need this faculty experience, which means a whole host of going through tenure, being successful in research, etc. I think in the next cycle of the survey, if we had to fast forward 5 years, is we will see that reliance on that historic faculty role shifting, because we need individuals that are increasingly more savvy with data, with being able to work with business, to be able to negotiate, which may not always have happened because I've had a faculty role for 20 years and I understand the academic institution. So being able to say, I understand what faculty do and the constraints or the challenges, and certainly having some ability to have spent some time in the classroom, I think is really important, because then you have an understanding of the academic enterprise. But when we're doing, for example, interviews for deans or for a provost, and someone on the hiring committee is a faculty member and says, well, I really want them to have kept an active research agenda, and they're going to be the dean or the provost. And I'm like, well, really? Like, I would like them to run a good meeting, and I would like them to be able to do strategic thinking. I think it's important that they understand the process of this, but if they have spent their career and are a provost that is still, say, actively working in a lab, how much does that divert from their ability to do some other things? So I think we're going to have some tension over choice as we're going to be moving forward in terms of what's going to serve us best. We need people who can bring people together. We need individuals who can talk about the value proposition of education in our country and be able to say to prospective students, you should come here because getting an education will allow you to do A, B, or C. With the recent downturns in enrollment trends and what we know is this demographic cliff fast approaching us, we need to really think as leaders in higher ed, how do we look at this differently? How do we sell ourselves in terms of saying education is the way up, in terms of being able to advance with your mobility economically, as well as for the betterment of society? We're losing some of that ground because we're not telling our story as well about that.
So let's go back to a comment that you made in your article for Inside Higher Ed, is talking about sponsorship versus mentorship, trying to get more women into the conversation around a presidency. Men seem to do that exceptionally well for each other. But there's not that much crossover, either women to women or men to women. And so talk to a little bit about what you mean and the differences with that.
So sponsorship, I think a lot about is making sure you're bringing someone's name into a room. So I might be able to mentor an individual and give them advice on what they might want to learn about, how they might want to prepare for a meeting or something of that nature. Whereas sponsoring means when I get an announcement for an award or for an opportunity to sit on a state or a federal panel, that I'm offering up lists of high caliber women for those opportunities. I'm sponsoring them and being an advocate in many ways for them. I think of it also as the way we're bringing people's names into rooms that they're not in. So we all on the campus might have opportunities to do this. Certainly top level leaders are in the best position to do this because they happen to be in the rooms where we want those names mentioned. So if you have this opportunity to put forth a person to say, I think you'd be really great for X, Y, or Z, how do we do that so we're seeing more representation? When you're in a provost office, for example, you often get information that is on national awards, state awards. How do you use those as opportunities to amplify the work you're seeing some of the women are doing on the campus and put their name forward for some of this? And being intentional about it. So for the women that have some of these aspirations, the idea of being able to come up to an individual saying, I'm actually interested in this. I'm actually interested in being an ACE fellow. Would you consider nominating me for that? Is a way you can advocate for yourself as you might look at some of those opportunities. And certainly this means you are ready to aspire to something. What I find often when you talk to presidents, it's not like they were 5 years old and went to kindergarten and said, I want to be a president when I grow up. People don't typically think that. I've had more than one president say, I've sort of got here accidentally. I kept going up and doing new positions. I was a chair, I was a dean, I was a provost. And then the next thing to do was to be a president. I've also had a group of leaders that will say, I was in a leadership cabinet meeting and I kept thinking, I can do this better than that. Like, I think I have some capability.
Yeah.
And the more you're around higher level leaders in particular, you can gain some confidence in being able to say, I could do that.
Yeah.
And the third route is when individuals are tapped. So this may happen because you have served on a university-wide committee and you come to the attention of someone on campus that says, this is a person that gets things done. They've asked great questions in this session. They are able to articulate the points well. And they say, so the leader says something to the individual, you should consider the next time a dean position comes open or a director position, where they may not have been thinking of it. So those venues tend to be the ways in which you can see that sponsorship being really helpful. And don't get me wrong, you still need mentors and you need people that are going to help in that way. But that ability to bring someone else's name into a room or being nominated for something, it is priceless to be able to see that in terms of advancement.
One of the things that I noticed when I received the 2023 study, and I noticed that there were a long list of things where presidents were looking for more information or education about a lot of different topics. There might have been 25 topics on there, but the one that stuck out to me was athletics. It was the first time I had seen it in the survey. It doesn't mean it hadn't been there many moons ago, but it certainly wasn't there in the last one. I think that might be a reflection of the changing nature of athletics. But I'm wondering, and I've heard this anecdotally from some women who've applied to presidencies, is that the athletics piece, whether they perceive that you get it or that you don't get it, can make or break a presidency, particularly in some of these larger doctoral Division I kind of institutions. How might your research help those candidates who are trying to think about a presidency at that level that say, I can do this job?
I think, we have a president who is an athlete herself. And so what I found as she was navigating coming onto campus, she was able to sort of walk the talk in that way. Not everyone has been an athlete to be able to have either that personal experience or the experience of working with a complex enterprise such as athletics. So one of the ways to do this, and this might apply to other areas where you feel like you don't have as much expertise, finance, budgeting often come to top of list, is as you're contemplating and working towards a presidency, is having stretch assignments and learning how to do these kind of activities by, in some ways, creating your own internship so that you're able to go and follow individuals who are really good in these areas, your AD, and be able to understand what are the nuances of working with teams and coaches. What does it mean from a fiscal perspective when we're trying to have a number of teams and we have a limited budget and we're trying to also address all Title IX and equity kind of issues, and figuring out where are some of these landmines. So the ability to just keep up with the popular press, to, reading national papers, reading the higher ed, Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, can be helpful because you can learn how to have the language of athletics as well. So if someone asks you during a search interview, what are the top 3 issues you think are facing campuses in the athletic arena? You need to have an answer. And you don't know where that question may come from. And it may be contextual based on something that recently happened on campus, and individuals, like a student might come up and say they want to get rid of the rowing team, and I'm really upset about that. Would you reinstate the rowing team if you come in as president? And so trying to be able to understand the nuances of what this means, to have these issues at the forefront so that you're able to address it, and doing these kind of either stretch assignments or in some ways they're add-ons, so that I'm going to volunteer and go on the committee that's doing the strategic plan for athletics. I'll be the outside campus representative so that I can understand how, at least at the campus I'm on, that campus is trying to think about the role of athletics in the larger picture. When we look at student engagement on campus, athletics is a huge aspect of that. How does a potential woman presidential candidate come in and link the importance of athletics to student engagement, to persistence, to graduation? And being able to look at the institution that you're interviewing with and look at their data. How many of the students on campus are student athletes? How many are taking part in intramural activities? What is the success rate? We typically find that student athletes get good at juggling and time management because they have to do this. And so knowing some of the data about the campus you're going to interview on is important as well. Being able to scout the local newspapers to understand for little things. Oh, I see the basketball team, went to the conference and ended up in the Final Four. That's really great. Like, this is information that is showing a fluency in the way we think of athletics on campus. And this would be true for other topical areas, but you want to have that fluency so that there is not that second guessing, because we know we all bring our biases to situations. So if the norm is not to expect a woman candidate to be as versed in the athletic complex on an institution, you need to dispel that as often and as quickly as possible. I think some of those implicit biases are often wrong, because women are very well versed in athletics and understanding of that as well. So it does cut both ways. But using even your cover letter going in for an application for a presidency can be a way to signal, I understand your campus. I understand the roles these various pieces will hold, research, athletics, student life, so that when you're coming in to talk with a search committee, there's going to be someone from each walk of those lives that is going to be there. And it is important, as it is in the interview process, it's just as important in the informal times. I'm walking to the car, they're transporting me from point A to B. That's another opportunity to engage. And so a candidate can bring up questions about that. oh, I noticed this, as you're thinking of funding or expanding this team or redoing the field house, what are you seeing as some of the touch points for alumni? What are the touch points for the community, so that you have a better sort of finger on the pulse of it as well?
Right, right. Wow, that's all really, really helpful insight. You mentioned a few times about facilities, and of course, facilities begets fundraising.
Yeah.
So how much does this survey tell you about women leaders' ability to fundraise? Are they better at some levels than others? Is a skill set perceived as being advantageous or disadvantageous?
It's certainly advantageous, especially in the climate we're in, as we're looking with enrollment struggles for tuition dependent institutions. I think it is one of the areas that across the board individuals indicate they'd like to learn more and do more about. When I've talked with groups of women as they're trying to think of moving up into higher level leadership positions, especially around the fundraising, is I point out to them that they often have these kind of skills because they've done things in community organizations or in school systems. And so those kind of skills are somewhat natural when you've had those kind of exposures. If you've not had that exposure, it's another place you can volunteer.
Yeah.
What happens if you volunteer for your United Way drive? What happens if you're on the hospital board and you're working on that fundraising piece? A lot of the work of fundraising is relationship building. And so being able to build these relationships and to sell what is important. So if you're looking at a new facility, I walked just today past our new expansion of our field house that is occurring right now. And when I think of the stories that were told during that fundraising aspect of it, you could really feel the excitement about how this was going to touch students' lives and give them better opportunities. It was going to bring the community in, so that when you can sell that kind of vision, the fundraising actually comes. I mean, not that it's not hard, but it's much easier when you have something that is valuable and you have a belief in that. And you can figure out what is it that's going to attract someone to donate for whatever purpose. We see scholarships as often an easier area for doing fundraising because individuals can see that direct benefit with it. When you're going to be talking about an athletic facility, part of it is trying to look at what are the possibilities if I have a better facility? What does that do for my athletes? What does that do ultimately for my revenue generation? Because I can have more people coming to events, or that it's a better environment to come in. So the community wants to bring their family to events because it's really a good activity and it's a point of joy. And so when you see that pride points, I think that kind of fundraising is a easier lift than you might anticipate.
Interesting. Wow. And you've done such a nice job of tying it back to all of it's been quite a ride the last few years at William and Mary. And maybe just share with my audience really quickly what happened in 2020 and where the campus is today with regards to athletics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we had a change in our athletic director that occurred right around that time. And it was also a time when some of our sports were at risk of being cut. And again, because of budgetary reasons. And it was a point of reckoning, I would say, as everyone around campus was, and in the community, to be honest with you, I'd go on runs with my colleagues and they'd say, what about what happened to the basketball coach? Or what about this? So there was a real investment by the community in some coaching changes and events that were happening. What that did is it provided the leadership here an opportunity to hit pause and say, how can we look at this in a way to explain what happened to get to these decision points, and how can we collectively look at changes to move us past this? So one of the first ventures in doing so was to really give a Finance 101 general public presentation to say, these teams cost X amount, we have Y amount, this is where the shortfall is, these are the ways we can do it. And what resulted was really an outpouring of support among alumni, former athletes, in terms of making up some of those gaps or having a clearer understanding of the why behind it. It allowed a way to tell the story for fund development markedly different as well. And when we see, especially in this last year, when we had some good athletic success with the football team and really a lot of bonding around some of these successes, we see ourselves, in my opinion, being able to turn a corner on this. And what we've done is heighten the literacy of our staff, faculty, community members on it takes a lot to run a team. Like, you may think, gosh, I just need to buy a few things and this is going to be fine. Well, those few things end up tallying into the millions. And so how we're able to show that and articulate it.
Yeah.
And it comes then also back to this value proposition of saying, these are valuable to have for these reasons. Our students have been able to have athletic success with championships in A, B, or C, and they've been able to go on for illustrious careers after college as well. And translating that to saying, and it costs money to do that.
Yeah.
And as we look, and again, this onion peeling of finance at a university, even as a public institution, we're getting maybe about 12% of our budget from Virginia, the government, and the rest is either through tuition revenue or fund development. And when you're able to educate the population around, and especially alum or donors, there's a different kind of recognition of, well, I didn't know that. And so you can't expect someone to know that. So that process of educating has been really, really helpful. I'll give you another example. We have a very prestigious excellence award on campus called the Plumeri Award. And one of our alum, Joe Plumeri, funds this award. And it was maybe it's been 4 or 5 years now. He began putting one of those awards aside for someone from athletics, because his athletic experience on campus was so pivotal to his development and his connections that he felt it's important to designate someone in the athletic area as a person of excellence. And it's been fascinating to watch the people that are coming out. So this year, the women's lacrosse coach was the recipient of one of the awards. And being able to showcase this coach on the stage with faculty who are also doing cutting edge research increases the profile of what that means for athletics on this campus. So having that award symbolically shows this is important to our college and university and to the students that are attending here, and we're recognizing it in this way. So you can see a full arc of where we've gone from, this time of a bit of turmoil to where we're starting to think and conceptualize what it means to have athletics on campus now.
That's a fascinating story because, it's so easy to demonize what you don't understand. And there's not been that kind of, that I'm aware of very often, a collective effort to help people understand, looking under the rocks and everything and seeing exactly how the money is spent. And that's what I think has been harmful to both higher education and athletics. So there've been two separate silos versus realizing it, we're all here together doing different things for the same outcome. And I applaud you guys. I think that's a really, really great way to look at it, because it brings a celebration to everybody. And it's not me versus them, it's us.
Mhm.
And I really, really appreciate that. Pamela, I can't tell you, you're number one, you're a great teacher, I can tell. And number two, you're a great storyteller, I can tell. And I really, really do appreciate you bringing both those skills to bear on this very important topic of women in presidencies and how we can support them and sponsor them, as you say, move them into the next level. So thank you for your time today.
Well, the stakes are high, so I really care about this quite
Yes.
a bit. And so I hope among your listeners, we light a spark among some of them to start contemplating this presidency as an idea.
I totally agree. I will tell you one thing. I had a master's student this spring who told me that she wants to be a college president. I was thrilled.
There you go. One at a time. That's what
right.
we need. We're going to build the whole capacity.
That's right. That's right. Thank you again for joining us.
Oh, happy to do that.